Hello, everybody, and welcome back to New Books in Middle East Studies. I'm James Dorsey, the co host of the channel. Today, we'll be talking to Peter Oborn about his new book, The Fate of Abraham: Why the West is Wrong About Islam. Peter's book is as much a history of US, British, and French relations with Islam as it is about a relationship that was almost doomed from the outset, not because of inherent problems with either the essence of the West or the essence of Islam, but because of prejudice, bias, and certainly in the 21st century, politicization and weaponization of religion on both sides of the divide. As we will see, many of the Western and non Western policy assumptions about Islam echo past fears and prejudices and debates that have fueled a widening gap and Islamophobia. Peter Oborn, welcome to the show.
It's a real privilege, James.
It's a pleasure to have you. Coming to write this book was a journey, given that it involved moving away, for you, moving away from the precepts of a military family and an elite private school education that initially steered you towards conservative media and conservative politics. To be fair, attitudes towards Islam, as discussed in your book, were not the only thing that persuaded you to take a step back. Ultimately, if I'm not incorrect, you left the Daily Telegraph because of its reporting about HSBC and tax dodging, rather than its stance on Islam. So tell us about the journey that you made.
I thought it was very important at the start of the book to explain why I was writing it, which is why I dwelt for a little bit on my kind of establishment credentials. As you say, come from a military family, went to Cambridge University and one of Britain's what we call public schools in Britain, actually private schools, of course, and and very much brought up in the sort of British military political establishment. Um, by the way, I don't think I've been myself on an intellectual journey. I think I'm the same conservative that I always have been. One of the big theses about this book is that it's conservatism which has gone on a journey. You not, and that explain neoconservatism has captured political and intellectual discourse first in the United States and now in Britain, and actually is a departure from the sort of conservatism which I believed in and still do. But nevertheless, this journey took me into journalism and in due course to the Spectator, which is the sort of where when Boris Johnson, who's now British Prime Minister, was the editor and I was the political uh, correspondent, and we we had a very sort of liberal. We were a liberal conservative paper. Boris Johnson wasn't the quite sinister creature he has become as British Prime Minister at all. He was a sort of optimistic, jolly, multicultural, highly intelligent, and gifted writer. Um, and we saw ourselves as a sort of, I think Boris used this phrase actually, we're a journal of manners more than a journal of politics. Um, and all the terrible things, and I think terrible is becoming the right word in Britain now, that all came later. It was a very eclectic paper at the time, representing Burkean. If it represented any conservatism, it was Burkean conservatism, a generous conservatism, conservatism which understood that Britishness embraces all sorts of different identities. You can be British and Scottish, and British and Scottish and advocate for Scottish independence. You can be, there's a wonderful rich heritage of immigrants coming for millennia. Just think of that fabulous generation of Jewish emigres to Britain, fleeing Nazi Germany before and after World War II, and so on. So it's a very complex identity of Britishness, but it allows everyone to have a home within it, and that, of course, includes Muslims. That was the kind of that's what I thought That's what the Conservative Party, to a very large extent, was when I started to report politics. I now move on to why I came to write the book. After at the time of 9/11, and then the Iraq War, and then the atrocity of 7/7 in London, the bombings. At the same time, there was a sort of almost militant misreporting of Muslim issues and of Islam, and it distorted the truth, and I didn't like it. It was the opposite of wise. It was shrill, and it was an attack on a minority. And that's another reason why I emphasize my conservative background, is because I believe in sticking up for minorities. I believe in sticking up for the underdog. That's a deep thing in Britain for me, and part of what I understand Britishness to be.
Thank you. I mean, that all of that comes indeed very clearly out in the book. And if we start turning to the book, perhaps we can start with looking at the history of British and French approaches towards Islam and its place in society and in the country. And those approaches were very different. In its colonial days, Britain still envisioned a multicultural empire, while France sought to make its colonies French, nowhere more so than in Algeria. How much of that is the result of very different encounters with Islam from the outset? And how does that impact domestic politics differently until today in Britain and France?
It's such an interesting question. If you look at the French experience, it starts with Napoleon. Well, you can take it, of course, back, and I think it's rather important to do this actually, to the victory over the Muslim armies in 1732, Charles Martel, and that is part of the French national myth now, taught in schools. And indeed, Gibbon says that if that victory hadn't happened, that was it, the call to prayer would be held in Oxford colleges, etc. But in modern times, reinforced by that important myth, we have we kick off with Napoleon. It's a sort of farcical journey in some ways to Egypt. Total disaster, but because Napoleon was a master of propaganda, he converted it into a great success. It was a very early enterprise in liberal imperialism. He brought with him all sorts of scholars, and actually he engaged in a much richer way with the local traditions than the next enterprise, which was 1830, the invasion of Algeria, which was a terrible event and inaugurated an era of settler colonialism. And really, it was the seizure of land. When the European empires seize land, that opens the way to genocide and ethnic cleansing, as it did in the United States with the native Indians, very much of the French, British, and Ireland at an earlier point in our history. And the local Muslim population was really offered the choice between surrendering their Muslim identity and becoming French, or being treated as barbarians. Now, if you there was a sort of awful massacres and the emergence of a local French settler population. Now, which had dark consequences for modern France as well. Britain kicks off in a rather different way. I mean, our great Queen Elizabeth I, who I think is even greater than Queen Elizabeth II, and that's saying an awful lot. She needed to create a foreign policy and a trading strategy which cut out Catholic Europe, which was then existential enemy of hers. They were trying to kill her and impose a Catholic queen, her cousin Anne Mary, the and so she formed these early alliances, fascinating alliances, flirtatious letters of Suleiman the Magnificent, and sort of building up, building up relationships with Muslim powers, both in North Africa and in Turkey and beyond. You find Britain's going to Aleppo at quite an early stage. So, and this is a trading relationship which carries on defining an awful lot of what Britain was doing, even when Britain started to, rather without meaning to acquire an empire. It didn't seize the land. It governed it indirectly or through minorities often, but this meant that it was perfectly happy as a general rule. There were exceptions to work with the local communities, with the local the local religions, not to impose themselves. Whereas the French were, that you were expected to embrace French values and become French. And that is one of the reasons when Britain surrendered her empire in the second half of the 20th century, as a general rule, it was much more relaxed business. And of course, there were terrible things happen. Think of partition, but in India. But it was a more whereas in France they fought Algeria fought that terrible war of independence, which has a massive legacy in France today, because the settler population of Algeria, which fought against independence and then came to France and is sort of the source of Marine Le Pen's and her father's, it's a source of a lot of the far right in France now, and likewise the Muslims, the Muslim population of Algeria, a lot of whom were obliged to come to France to seek jobs, and they are the basis of that. Also come from Algeria, and they bring with them their own legacy, and awful things have happened on the French mainland as well as in Algeria. There was that. So it's a very dark legacy, much more benign in Britain. So the multiculturalism of the British Empire came to Britain after World War II. Communities, not just Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, came to Britain, particularly from the South Asia, and established themselves in this country. And it's an immigration, in my view, has not, as a whole, and multiculturalism has been a great success in Britain.
In many ways, that sort of anti-Muslim sentiment, if you wish, was accelerated obviously by 9/11 and was sharpened when Islam sort of succeeded communism as the enemy. Um, it also led to a redefinition or a definition of what, or an expansion of what a bad Muslim constitutes. Um, Interestingly enough, you in the book also trace the notion of a bad Muslim as going back to Aladdin, the Middle Eastern folktale figure. Perhaps you can draw that sort of history of the notion of a bad Muslim and tell us in what ways and with what consequences the definition of the bad Muslim expanded post 9/11.
Yes. So if you look at the back end of the British Empire in India, the British governing class did pursue a strategy of divide and rule. And there were good Muslims, were those Muslims and indeed good local, good Hindus too, who accommodated themselves to British rule. Bad ones were those who tried to get rid of the British, and they were respectively the moderates were the good ones, and extremists were the bad ones. They were extreme. And I did I was so interested in this word extremist because it's now become a scare word about Muslims generally. That I did a search for it, of the use of it in the House of Commons, Hansard of parliamentary debates. The first time you came across this term was used by Viscount Hemsley, who tragically died. Talking in, I think, 1912. He died on the Western Front 5 years later, but he stood up and said extremists, these women who wanted the vote, which he disapproved of, he said these were extremists who wanted to have the vote against moderate women who realized their place in society. Now, obviously, that nowadays, if you said that women who wanted to vote were extremists, it would be an extremist thing to say that they shouldn't have it. Then its next use, next use I found of the term extremist about those who wanted Indian independence. And again, I'd say it's moderate Indians were those who would like to work in harmony with the Brits, whereas the extremists didn't. Now, it's so interesting that we have had, both in the United States and in France, but particularly in Britain, I think, the creation of a new public language to determine and define and categorize Muslims. So the first one is moderate versus extremists. A moderate Muslim in Britain today, according to the official class, and I devote a lot of time to describing how this new language was created, is one who is happy essentially to renounce his or her Muslim identity. A liberal Muslim, whereas an extremist Muslim is one who persists in being a Muslim in an external sense. Maybe it's clothes, maybe it's beliefs about sticking to the teaching of Islam, or criticizing British or American foreign policy. It's very interesting. It's very interesting the way in which. Sorry, I lost my way. You can just slice that off. I'm just. Yeah. Then we had the creation of another term. It's called non-violent extremism, and this is a sinister term, invented, as far as I could tell, by think tanks, creating a new policy towards Islam in the wake of 9/11. Now, non-violent extremism, it's clearly a scare word, extremism, but it's somebody who doesn't want to, non-violent, i.e. they're not committing any crime, they're just holding opinions which are thought to be unsatisfactory or dangerous, and put you on an escalator towards violence. And that process of moving towards violence is called radicalization in the pseudoscientific literature, which was produced by think tanks and within Whitehall and in government, in order to define this journey which allegedly Muslims go on if they start to if they start to become rather too religious, pray 5 times a day, start to show an interest in going to mosques, possibly look at get excited about the cause of the Palestinians, etc. And so this has emerged, and it's frightening to me. It's very profoundly un-British, and that is thought crime. And you can get punished and isolated, not punished in the sense of going to jail, but punished in the sense of cut out of the public square, put on lists and so forth, for advocating that sort of opinion. They also invented, and this is something called British values. This has become a major part of the official government analysis of Muslims. If you adopt British values, you're a good person, a good Muslim. If you're against British values, you're an extremist. Now, if you look at the definition of British values, it says things like tolerance, you support tolerance, freedom, free speech, etc. And there's nothing actually specifically. First thing to say, it's nothing specifically British about this. I mean, all sorts of people around the world, countries support these things, and also um, something very un-British about the idea of British values. Nobody has ever, um, these are all ideas which. I'll start again. Um, there's something very un-British about the idea of British values because Britain has always been such a generous place. It doesn't demand that you think in a certain way in order to be British. What you're talking about here is values of coercive liberalism, because these are values which are incompatible with unorthodox beliefs, particularly religious beliefs in a secular society. So they are, although it doesn't, the legislation and the way they're used doesn't say especially that Muslims don't abide by them. It's quite clear from the underlying usage of the term that this is aimed at Muslims who don't adhere to British values. So it's a term which has been constructed to pillory or to isolate a significant minority of our fellow citizens. Um, and I think it's an extremely troubling usage. It's also, ironically, and it's so applied in such an invidious way. For instance, two out of the last three British prime ministers went to a school called Eton, which does not permit women. Now, that is in clear infringement of the tolerance embedded in the concept of British values, but nobody will ever accuse David Cameron or Boris Johnson of being un-British, or in that matter, Eton. But for Muslim schools which maybe separate boys and girls in different halves of the class, this is a great infringement against the British values. So it's used in a very selective way in order to pillory a community, and also it then becomes the basis for what we in Britain it's the prevent strategy, which means that if you don't adhere to British values, particularly inside schools, you're likely to be picked up and put on the so-called prevent program, suspected of becoming radical, and many Muslims feel, and I completely sympathize with them, that they are living in something increasingly like a police state.
You in the book you just talked about the role of think tanks in this whole process, and in the book you describe in some great detail two of those think tanks. One is Kiliam, the other is the Policy Exchange. Tell us why you saw them as being so important.
Yeah, first of all, I'll talk about Quilliam, which is important because in the aftermath of 9/11, intellectuals on both sides of the Atlantic um, looked back to the aftermath of World War II very explicitly and deliberately, looked back at the Cold War when we had um, created a security architecture to fight communism, but also an intelligence architecture. And the CIA wondered um, how to use soft power to fight communism, and that was by creating a kind of a school of a kind of approved social democrat who was regarded as being acceptable to the United States as against a sort of straightforward Soviet support. Um, in order to encourage these sort of soft communists, I call them, enormous amount of resources in terms of propaganda and intelligence was devoted to creating a series of um, what appeared to be kind of legitimate civil society organizations, but were actually funded by the CIA. And the same thing happened in Britain. The same kind of organizations were set up. Many writers and intellectuals all around the West and indeed the rest of the world were implicated in this. I have my mixed feelings. It was secret and it involved deception, but equally, the Soviet Union was a genuine existential threat to the West. You can't say the same. And so they went, and so when the Cold War ended, all these organizations were closed down. But when after 9/11, they were set up, the policymakers in Whitehall set up, looked back at what had been done at the start of the Cold War and set up similar organizations. Now, Quilliam is one example, quite an important one. It was set up by two or three former Islamists. It's another Islamist is another manifestation of the new language. It's a sort of scare word for Muslim, in my view. It doesn't have a lot of other meaning. Former Islamists were sort of sponsored and given money by the Home Office in Britain to set up this organization, which would preach another square word. Well, preach moderate Islam against extremism, and part of the way they and I did some research. Part of the way they interpreted their job was to send a list of dangerous extremist Muslims to the Home Office, Muslims who or Muslim organizations who should be treated with suspicion and put on kind of secret blacklists, in effect. This takes us into a sort of McCarthyite world where Muslims who are politically active in a way which is deemed unhelpful by the British state suddenly are on lists and denied access to all sorts of things without even knowing about it. Whereas another category of good Muslims who are officially sponsored, given money, and given access to the public space, particularly organizations like the British BBC. They find themselves often on very privileged forums where they can put out the moderate Muslim message. So you're trying to shape a Muslim identity which is approved of by the British state. Anyway, Quilliam set out on this journey, and it wasn't taken that seriously by the general Muslim population. And after a while, its sort of Whitehall handlers lost faith in it. And I chart its weird and wonderful course to the sort of taking money instead from agenda-driven American foundations, some of which had looked pretty far right to me, and really, the Quilliam was named after this rather wonderful Briton, one of many actually, who was so sympathetic to in the 19th century to Islam that Quilliam converted or reverted, and he had very radical views about foreign policy, and he played a wonderfully and creative role. Very interesting person, and I think he probably would have been rolling in his grave at some of the things which were done in his name by Quilliam. Point really about Quilliam is there's a lot of other organizations around the place which look pretty much as if they've come from civil society, spontaneous sort of organizations which Habermas would recognize as being part of the public space, which are actually funded by the British government and are not exactly what they seem.
A lot of this played out or was graphically illustrated, perhaps. Or before we go into that, Talk a little bit about Policy Exchange, if you will.
Yeah, Politics Change is exceptionally interesting because more than any other organization, I think it has been extremely successful in creating the government view towards Muslims in Britain. Um, I I look I did there was a battle inside the Conservative Party uh, at the start of the 21st century about how to approach Muslims. On the one hand, there was a rather brilliant, I think, charismatic um, Saeed Abbasi, who is a young conservative politician at the time, really concerned about issues to do with Palestine. She eventually resigned about over the British government sort of failure to condemn the attack on Gaza in 2014. But she represented a very optimistic interpretation of what Muslims could do in British life. They're hardworking, they're very family minded, they've got very much conservative values, and it's up to the British government to engage. Whereas there was an alternative strategy, which essentially were that Islam, or Islamism as it was called, posed an existential threat to the West. And that, the kind of architect of that, or the figurehead for it, was another conservative politician, Michael Gove, who is now a senior cabinet minister in the Johnson government, very close to Rupert Murdoch, because he worked for the Times newspaper for a long time. And he was the founding chairman from memory, of Policy Exchange, which is a think tank. And I looked at the publications of Policy Exchange in the first 10 years of this century. And basically, they sketch out the policy. They set out the policies which have defined British Muslims for the last 20 years, and that is that Islamism is an existential threat to the West. There are two types of Muslims. There's the ones who, the moderates, and then there are the Islamists who must not actually be allowed, must be isolated, never embraced, and regarded as subversive. And that is what has happened. And it is it is interesting to read how they set out these papers. They, in particular, what they wanted to do was to reject the counter-terrorism strategy which the British had applied in Northern Ireland, and then the British, I think, emerged with great honour from that tragic conflict in Northern Ireland, in which all sides were to blame. But the British state, I think, managed it as fairly well. And they were, while they accepted all along that violent acts must be punished, they also said that subversion, i.e., belief in Irish independence, was not a crime. That was not something that the Brits were going to get worried about, so-called subversion. And Policy Exchange wanted the reintroduction of the idea of subversion when it came to Muslims. And that is, I think, that what has happened. If you have views which the state doesn't like, you're regarded as somebody who should be investigated. In other words, there is a set of our fellow citizens in this country now who are regarded as subversive simply because of the views which they hold. Now, that is, for me as a British citizen, as I set out at the beginning of this chat, as a conservative British citizen with an understanding of what it means to be British, this is an outrageous thing to allow to happen. If you think about the way our history, and I think I'm very proud to be British, has been made. You think about the great radicals at the time of the French Revolution, who had formed the trade union movement. They were very subversive. They were absolutely against the state, but we must honor them. Think about Keir Hardie and the other great figures who formed the Labour Party and gave a voice in Parliament to the working classes, profoundly subversive. But these are people we must honor today and do honor. Likewise, the people who fought for Indian independence. Do we honor Gandhi? Yes, absolutely, we honor Gandhi. He was regarded as a total subversive. The women, the incredibly brave women who fought for women's liberation, for the vote, and all of that, they were so subversive. But what we have done is we have formed a special category of subversive but honourable, public-spirited Muslims who fight really for better, speak up for their community and their view of how the world should work. And of course, people who want to blow us up should be arrested, spied on. There's got to be this. It's the job of the state to protect the security of its citizens more than anything else. But these are people who just have unorthodox views and are treated as subversive. It really upsets me. It's the major moral driver of the book I've written.
The book is full of fascinating little facts, contradictions, analogies, and I want to touch on two of them. One of them, the first one is you basically note that the British public didn't display a lot of interest in colonial affairs, certainly in the first part of the 20th century. But its rule over a large number of Muslims did impact debate and policies in Britain itself. And for example, it was one argument that was used against lowering the voting age of women from 21 to 30.
Oh yes,
I just found
that's Colonel Aplin, isn't it? We discovered him speaking in Parliament. I think he was a fairly gruesome character, Colonel Aplin. But he was, whether we're wanting to reduce the age of women from 30 to 21, I think he'd been a policeman in Borneo, hadn't he, actually? He's getting this thunderous denunciation of the damage this would do to the 400 million Muslims or so who were under the British Empire. They wouldn't like it a bit. And he gave this as a reason for not. It is interesting, though, isn't it, how the women question is emerging there and being framed by an imperialist.
I found that absolutely fascinating. I also did find fascinating the comparison that you drew between the contemporary demonization of the Sharia and the demonization of coffee in the 16th century.
Yes. The coffee was basically, which was of course brought to the West to Britain by Muslims and was meant to cause all sorts of immorality and of course feed into the demonization of Muslims as sort of irrational, lascivious, and so forth.
Let's move for a moment to the United States, which obviously also is a big part of your book. And perhaps we could start chronologically with the place of Islam and of Black Muslim slaves in American slavery. The first Muslims came to the U.S. about 400 years ago as slaves. And yet, until the 9/11 attacks, their influence on U.S. politics and culture was marginal.
There were no question that there were millions of Muslim slaves were part of that dreadful passage from Africa to the United States, what is now the United States, in the 17th, 18th centuries. And many perished, and their stories are almost entirely unrecorded. But I tell you what I think is important, and I realized, is the importance of the Holy Bible in the construction of the American national consciousness. The Pilgrim Fathers, until the night, they believed really that they they saw themselves, didn't they, as the Jews entering the Promised Land, and they they were the elect, so people, and this affected very deeply, I think, the way they saw the native Indians they encountered, and this fed on into the way in which they eventually, when Americans met Muslims, first of all in their first foreign war against the Barbary pirates in the back end of the 90s, well, just after the War of Independence, when suddenly the American shipping didn't have the protection of the British Navy, and they were subject to the Barbary pirates, and they had to deal with them. And the Barbary Wars have been written up since, and were seen at the time as the clash of civilizations between these barbaric savages, i.e., Islam, and the noble Christian religion. And actually, you can see that same narrative emerge in the way the Barbary Wars were published. When the neocons really get going, launching a series of wars against Muslims at the start of the 21st century, and then the second, after the Barbary Wars, we then have another long period of silence about Muslims until the war in the Philippines at the back of 1898. Now, there's a substantial, although this war was basically created by the decaying remnants of the Spanish Empire, which had owned the Philippines, but in the southern Philippines, there were the so-called Moros, who was a very ancient indigenous since been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, well before the Spanish. The Moros have come there with Arab traders 1,000 years earlier, and they occupied the southern islands. And when the Americans arrived, the soldiers had come from 3 decades of fighting the native Indians in the Midwest. And they'd seen the native Indians as subhuman, not part of the sort of they weren't American citizens. They were just savages to be killed at will. Treaties entered into them to be broken. Something like James, do we think it was a genocide of the native Indians? Would you call it that?
I'm hesitant, but it's just hesitant because I haven't looked at it that closely.
Yeah, I mean, something like that.
And I also, I think there's a distinction between genocide and mass murder.
Yeah, let's call it
mass extermination.
Let's call it mass murder.
And so I'm very genocide. Let me put it differently. I think the word genocide is often too liberally used.
I completely agree with you. So let's say mass murder, but lots and lots of barbarous atrocities, and certainly what people call ethnic cleansing. Either lands were taken from them, and the Americans treated the Moros along those lines. They weren't recognized as being human beings, although 1 or 2 of them were brought back as exhibits to the United States at various fairs, and so that is the relationship between the United States and Islam and Muslims for the first 200 years or 150 years after 1776. You then do get quite a lot of Muslim emigration from the collapsing Ottoman Empire, from Syria and Lebanon, and those populations quickly abandon their Muslim identity. And then I think in the start of the post-war era, you have post-Second World War era, you have quite a benign relationship between the United States and Islam. It's a very happy period. And this is because the led by Roosevelt onwards, American presidents realized the importance of oil. And so Saudi Arabia suddenly becomes of enormous importance. And lots and the Americans, the United States takes over from the Britons as the power in the Middle East. Uh, Lots and lots of Muslims from these countries, Middle Eastern countries, flock to U.S. universities. Among them, Said Qutb, who was picked, I think, probably by the State Department to go to American University. He found he didn't like America. He was repelled by the commercialism, the consumerism he saw, and then went back and um, was the enemy of Nasser, rotted in a cell for 10 years, where he was eventually murdered by the Egyptian state, but wrote works which were inspirational for Al Qaeda. But that was a very happy period, that post-war period, in terms of the relationship. It's all the moving, almost the last thing which Roosevelt did was to meet Ibn Saud, the ruler of Saudi Arabia, and form a new set of alliances. It's in the 70s that 1970s, events in Israel, Palestine, and of course the 1979 Iranian Revolution, where things start to go very sour indeed. What the Americans did do, though, which caused huge problems for the future, was set in motion a set of relationships with Islamic states which were fundamentally anti-democratic in nature. One of the most terrible events of the early post-war period was the CIA MI6 arranged coup d'etat against the Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran, because he started to take the unpopular view, as far as the West was concerned, that Iranian oil should actually belong to the Iranians. And that led to the removal of a democratically elected leader of Iran, who believed in all the values which we say we believe in, i.e., freedom, parliamentary democracy, rule of law, etc., and replace him with a dictator, the Shah of Iran, who ruled for 30 years, using American arms, secret police, total brutality, and opened, and so naturally the Iranian people started to form an unhappy view of the of the United States, and that was part of a series of such relationships where America forms alliances with Saudi, the Gulf states, with effectively despots who absolutely crack down on any sign of freedom of speech, democratic activity, public gatherings. And we in Britain, we in the West, we above all the United States, are on the sides of despotism against democracy across the Middle East. And the legacy of that is utterly terrible. And it has to be said that this bears a serious responsibility, this systemic pattern of alliances with dictatorships, for the rise of Al Qaeda, because the logic of people who wanted to be democratic was that we should form parties, we should challenge despotisms democratically, but if you did that, you became an enemy of the state. You also became an enemy of the West. You were deemed to be a terrorist, you were locked up, you were tortured. And Al Qaeda and nascent Al Qaeda, as it emerged, says, "Look, the West will never tolerate democracy. Don't be ridiculous." And that has provided an ideological justification for the terrible things which Al Qaeda and ISIS have done.
All of this, and then particularly 9/11, is brought forward in the United States, but also elsewhere, sort of a new whole crop of evangelical and atheist Islamophobic thinkers. Uh, Talk to us a little bit about who they are and what impact they have.
Yeah, it's when after 9/11, the United States goes mad. I think that's the only. Probably it always was mad. Um, you get a dialogue about Muslims, which is kind of off the scale crazy. Um, it's a huge amount of money to be made by talking absolute nonsense about Islamophobia, about Muslims. You can say whatever you like, that they want to take over America, that um, they are evil, they're barbaric, and you will get a mass audience. What made it more dangerous was the several different forces came together to make this argument and were very, very powerfully effective when it came to convincing US presidents. On the one hand, you had the Christian evangelicals who believed in an approaching end of the world. This has been an enduring feature of United States history, dating right back to the founding fathers, but it really got going in the middle of the 19th century. This millenarian eschatology, whereby at some point Christ comes back, or the Messiah, and then you get the Antichrist, and then you get Armageddon somewhere in the Middle East. And out of all this horror, the Christians survive. The Jewish people have a sort of useful role in because they have to, according to this eschatology, go back to Israel. But their long-term future, according to this demented Christian eschatology, is absolutely hopeless. They are doomed to. But the elect get saved after the Great Tribulation and suffering. There's a series of total nutcases and still going strong, unfortunately, in the United States, who have been very influential in persuading US presidents to talk their language. Indeed, George W. Bush referenced them quite a lot, but actually, it's not that much of a surprise. I discovered he had an ancestor somewhere in the mid 19th century who was also called George Bush, and actually the direct ancestor of two presidents who came up with this kind of nonsense. He total anti-Semite. He wanted the Jews to go to Israel, not because he liked the Jews, he didn't, but he wanted them out of America. And also because that, in order to do that, the effect of that, according to the demented thinking which he promoted, was to enable the end times to come that much quicker. So you have this. Muslims have, of course, in that plan for the world's future, and tens of millions of Americans believe it, had no role at all, apart from they were often associated with the Antichrist. Then you get the atheists. I think you get the atheists were driven, the new atheism. I'm going to read out a few passages. From very rather respectable public figures who sort of echo Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont preaching the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century. But it's the same stuff. And there's a man called Sam Harris. I believe he's still. Let me find Mr. Sam Harris. The End of Faith. Now, it's important to, I mean, it's important to say about atheists like Sam Harris or his sort of ally, the British public intellectual Christopher Hitchens, that I think they do dislike all religions. It isn't just Muslims who they dislike. They think that Christianity is a disaster. But I think that the environment of the time enfranchised them to um, go after Muslims in particular. So look about this. This is Sam Harris, quite a respectable person, coming up with stuff like this. It is time we admitted that we are not at war with terrorism. We are at war with Islam. This is not to say we are at war with all Muslims, but we are absolutely at war with a vision of life that is prescribed to all Muslims in the Quran, and so on and so forth. But any Muslim all Muslims revere the Quran, see it as the word of God. So he was being intellectually dishonest. It's an attack on a community. There were a series of moral panics, of which the most one of the most notable, because so many senior politicians joined into it, was about the alleged building of a mosque near the site of the Twin Towers. A form of collective hysteria captured the United States in the aftermath of 9/11, and it became almost impossible to be a Muslim, I think, in those circumstances. Or if you were, you had to keep quiet about it. It's why I really admire certain Muslims who kept their head. Mehdi Hassan, who's a Briton, who now is an American citizen, has been remarkable in that way. But American mainstream television became a sort of hunting ground to excoriate, to intimidate, to mock Muslims in general. And and it formed the basis, of course, for that awful presidential campaign from President Trump in 2016, and the ban on Muslims from coming into the United States. It was all nonsense, but it was so damaging. And I do admire Muslims who have stayed there, and of course, the decent Americans who saw through all of this stuff. John Esposito, the professor at Georgetown University, is another person I think has spoken, as you have, James, kind of talk sense here and been a redress. But you've been minority voices, and because you often are in academia, you're sort of, you're put into would they say that, wouldn't they category. You're members of the liberal elite.
Right. Peter, unfortunately, the clock is ticking. I usually tell people we could go on for another hour, but I'll tell you that we could easily go on for another 2 hours. Unfortunately, time is running out. However, before I let you go, tell us what you are working on now and what your next project will be.
James, I feel I can't leave this project. There are so many things which I have discovered in the course of researching a book. As you know, when you write a book, it's an amazing journey, isn't it? And once you've written it, there's all sorts of things you then discover which ought to be in the book. And so I'm not going to leave. Yeah, and I'm going to go on looking into the think tanks which have created this warped view of Islam. I'm going to have a series of articles planned about Muslim charities which have done wonderful work but have been smeared as being somehow violent when they aren't, and it's becoming more and more difficult to be a Muslim and live in public life, anything like a public life in Britain, and probably right across the West. In France, the same attack is going on. But all it is a very simple thing. And actually, this is, again, why I want to say this to you. I was very lucky to have a wonderful grandfather, war hero. He was one of the last out at Dunkirk in 1940, and he was on day 2 of D-Day. And above my desk when I wrote this book, I went and got the citation for his distinct DSO, distinguished service order. It's a very, and he never talked about it when he was alive. He just said it wasn't for me anyway. It was from the men. And I got hold of it. It's pretty amazing how he was an engineer. He'd build bridges across, when British Army was going across Europe, he'd go ahead and build the bridge. And obviously you're building that bridge, aren't you? You're going out in boats under small arms fire. That's what it said. Accurate German small arms fire. But he was a very soft-spoken man. Never talked about any of that. But except that one thing, the reason we fought World War II was to fight fascism. We were there for the underdog, so that they could live free lives, whether it was the Jews who were exterminated under the Nazis or the small nations which were obliterated. We were fighting that war for decency. And I like to think that when I wrote this book, I was honoring my grandfather and what he fought for in World War II.
Peter, there's clearly a lot of you in this book and a lot of passion as you go forward. I, for one, certainly look forward to continue reading you. In the meantime, thank you for being on the show today. I really enjoyed it. All the best and take care.
It's a real privilege to come on your show, James.
Please subscribe to my YouTube channel at James M. Dorsey Media, one word, and click the notification button for more updates. Also, please become a paid subscriber by going to www.jamesmdorsey.substack.com or making a donation at www.jamesmdorsey.net, so I can keep distributing the column for free to achieve the widest distribution possible. Thank you.